Today we have Deidre Larkin. Deidre is a horticulturist and a historian with a special interest in the medieval plant world. She received her horticultural training at the New York Botanical Garden, where she was also an instructor in the School of Continuing Education from 1991 until 2011. She was an advisor on plants and gardens to the Center of Medieval Studies at the Pennsylvania State University from 1998 to 2008. And she was formerly the managing horticulturist at the Cloisters Museum and Gardens, home to an extensive collection of both medieval art and plants. She was associated with the gardens there for more than 20 years and was the originator of and the principal contributor to the Medieval Garden Enclosed blog, which was published from 1998 through 2013, and is still available for you to research and read some of those blog entries. She's also a member of the New York unit and has been for 25 years, is just welcomed into the Rosemary Circle. So Deidre, we welcome you and look forward to this presentation on medieval herbs for modern gardens. So you may begin.
Good morning, everyone. Of course, I have spoken many times to members of the Herb Society, but never before without being able to see you. So it is a little bit strange to not have the pleasure of seeing your faces, but I will just simply proceed through the program, and I will be happy to answer as many questions as time allows when we reach the end of the program. And I have also provided my contact information on the handouts, so that if you should want to contact me directly to get an answer to a question we didn't have time for, I'll be very happy to hear from you. So just looking at the title screen here, I'd like to say a few words. There's a very charming image, as you can see on the left, which is actually from an allegory that dates to the 15th century. It is a defense by a woman poet named Christine de Besson of women against the ravings of another poet who was one of the most famous misogynists of the Middle Ages. And this is from the City of Ladies, and what you see is the Lady of the Manor overseeing the work in the garden being done by her servant. And of course, women were very actively involved in gardening in the Middle Ages, and they were also symbolically associated with gardens and are often represented in gardens in medieval art. And today I'm going to be showing you not only plants in nature, in the gardens, but also plants in medieval art, and sharing a lot of very interesting quotations from medieval poems and romances. So having said that, we're just going to start. And the first thing I'd like to talk to you about is how we know what plants were grown in the Middle Ages. What was grown in monastic gardens, what was grown in kitchen gardens that included many herbs, what was grown in medicinal gardens, whether they were part of a monastery or part of a lay school of medicine, because there were schools of medicine in the Middle Ages that were not part of the church, the most famous one being in Salerno in Italy, which rose to greatness in the 12th century. So the good news is that although there's a lot of darkness between what we know of the gardens of the Roman Empire and what we know about the gardens of the Middle Ages, by the 9th century, which is fairly early in the Middle Ages, we usually think of the Middle Ages as extending from about the end of the 6th century through to the end of the 15th century, we do have actual plant lists from various sources where we can feel quite sure that we know what was grown. And what you see on the left of your screen is from a very famous literary document on medieval gardens, and that is a poem by a monk who was also the abbot of his monastery, who wrote about the plants that he grew there, addressing them in poetic terms, but also giving some hardcore information about their uses and about the way that he grew them. Now, the name of this poem now is generally known as the Hortulus, which means the little garden, but the actual name of the poem appears in this first line of the document here. And so properly, the actual title given to it by this monk was De Cultura Hortorum, concerning the cultivation of gardens. And you'll see that down below that, after some introductory remarks on how difficult it is to make a garden, he proceeds to list some of the herbs that he grows, and he'll go on to address them and discuss them. And just running quickly down the list, you'll see, I'll translate them for you. They're in the original Latin. You'll see sage, rue, wormwood, some gourds and peppers are included in there. You see absinthium, which is, of course, absinthe, marubium, which is horehound, fennel, gladiola, which is iris, and the last is actually lovage, a favorite plant of the New York unit. So we do have these lists, and on the right-hand side, we have another one of these important 9th century documents, and this is a capitulary of the Emperor Charlemagne. And in this capitulary, what he does is to lay out instructions for the way that he wants his medieval estates managed. And he provides in one chapter a list of the plants that are to be grown on his estates. And these include plants that were used for practical purposes and also for medicinal purposes. So there is quite a bit of overlap, although the poet on the left only talks about 20 some odd plants. The one on the right lists 80 some odd plants. There is overlap, and so we begin to get a sense of what the most important plants in fact were. Now this is actually a translation of that list that you just saw on the right-hand page, in which the emperor declares which plants he wants grown on his estates. And now I sort of greened out a lot of the vegetables. So you really are looking at a list of the plants that were used for medicinal and practical purposes, and that we would categorize as herbs rather than vegetables. But of course, I am throughout the talk using the definition that we're all familiar with of an herb as a plant with a use. So here you might be surprised to see, and it's something that we'll talk about later, that many garden flowers, as well as the plants that we customarily think of as the herbs of the Middle Ages, were used for medicinal and practical purposes, even though they had sacred symbolisms at the same time. And that seems a little bit odd to us, but that's something we'll talk about later. So you see here that we have lilies, roses, sage, rue, southernwood, pennyroyal, lovage, savory, many of them, mints, many of the plants that were also grown by Walafrid Strabo in his garden are grown, are decreed to be grown in the Emperor Charlemagne's garden. Now the next thing that we're looking at is a plan of the monastery of St. Gall, which dates again to the 9th century. The 9th century is when we really begin to know something about medieval gardens and their herbs. And on the left, what you see is the actual parchment of the plan, which is very, very difficult to read. But on the right, I've given you a rendering of the plan in which you can see the horticultural spaces on the garden. And these three things, the Hortulus of Walafrid Strabo, which is a poem, the capitulary of the Emperor Charlemagne, which is a legal document, and the plan of the monastery of St. Gall, which was never really built as planned, although there's a large and important monastery at St. Gall in Switzerland, nevertheless gives us good information about the way medieval gardens were laid out and designed. These three things are really the basis of what we know about medieval gardens. So if you look up in the left-hand corner here of the plan, you see the medical herb garden. Then if you come over a little bit here, you see the vegetable garden. Both of these gardens are laid out the way we still lay out our kitchen gardens, in rectangular rows. In this case, they're parallel. It's a very simple, very, very old way of laying out a kitchen garden that persists to this day. It's a very conservative form. And then just to the left here, you see one other cultivated space, which is a cemetery orchard. But I'm not going to talk about fruits today. I am really going to concentrate on herbs and flowers that were used herbally in the Middle Ages. Now, fortunately for us, the plants that were grown in the in the medicinal herb garden, which is what I'm going to look at, were actually written out on the beds of the plant, which is a great thing. Now, scholars debate about whether this was really to be taken literally. Maybe this is just an indication. But nevertheless, again, you'll recognize some of the names of the herbs that we just looked at in the other two sources. Up at the top, we have cosmary and fenugreek. We have savory over here. We have fennel, pennyroyal, lovage, iris, cumin, rue, salvia. This is actually watercress, roses, lilies, mints, and of course rosemary, which we'd expect to be there. But we do have very, very good documentation for these early 9th century gardens, but nothing much before that. Now, how do we know how medieval herbs were used? That really comes from a different category of literature. Now, although Walafrid Strabo certainly gives us some information about their medicinal uses. But when we are doing research on the actual uses of medieval herbs, we do resort, of course, to herbals, which generally represented the plant, sometimes very naturalistically, sometimes in a very stylized way, and gave information about where it was found, how it might grow, and how it was used. Now again, there's a gap in our knowledge between antiquity and the Middle Ages, but we actually know, because these early medieval herbals I'm showing you were copied from ancient originals in the monasteries, we know that basically the herbal knowledge of the Middle Ages was inherited from antiquity and was supplemented by the folk medicine of individual countries within Europe. So over on the left, you see one of the first plants I'm going to talk about as an iconic medieval herb, which is mentioned in all the lists that we have seen so far, and this is fennel. And this is a page from the Herbal of Dyestuffs. Dyestuffs was a Greek army doctor in the service of the Roman army. He wrote in the 1st century AD, but he remained an authority quoted throughout the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. And one of the earliest manuscripts that we have of his that survives dates to the 7th century, and it's in the Austrian National Library in Vienna, and here you see it there on the left. Now over on the right, this is the plant that is actually going to be the last plant I talk to you about today, and this is an arum, Dracunculus vulgaris, but we'll get to that later. But this is from yet another late antique herbal, probably compiled in the 4th century, that survived throughout the Middle Ages. Now I'm showing you an early version that dates to the 6th century, which is in Leiden, but there are versions of this herbal that were made in the 9th century, in the 12th century, and throughout the Middle Ages. Now, fennel, as I said, was one of these herbs that we really will find on almost every list of medieval plants. And it had many, many uses. And I've given you a quotation here from Walafrid Strabo's poem, The Hortulus, so that you can get a flavor of that poem. Let us not forget to honor fennel. It grows on a strong stem and spreads its branches wide. Its taste is sweet enough, sweet to its smell. They say it is good for eyes whose sight is clouded, that its seeds taken with milk from a pregnant goat eases a swollen stomach and quickly loosens sluggish bowels. What is more, your rasping cough will go if you take fennel root mixed with wine. So here you see, it's very characteristic of Oliphant Strabo, that he combines these poetic addresses. He clearly loves his plants. He admires them for his beauty, but he's very well informed about their uses. And in fact, fennel was particularly renowned as a cure for poor sight. It was even believed that it would improve the eyesight of snakes who rubbed up against it in order to benefit. Now, not all the herbal knowledge associated with fennel is comprised in that poem. We have other sources as well. And according to the herbals, fennel was a diet plant. It helped you to lose weight, and I think it still sustains that reputation today. And it was also thought to suppress your appetite. And so we have in the great medieval poem Piers Plowman a reference to a poor man who has a pennyworth of fennel in his purse to eat on fast days to keep him from getting too hungry. Probably the most famous and iconic herb of the Middle Ages, universally renowned in antiquity and well after, is salvia or sage. And in fact, the name salvia comes from the Latin verb salvare, to save. There were many, many proverbs about the virtues of sage. One that dates to that medical school in Italy I told you about goes, "Why should a man die who has sage in his garden?" It was also addressed as salvia salvatrix, sage the savioress. It really had a reputation as a panacea and a universal cure-all. Now there is some question about whether sage was the sage that was so famous in antiquity was the one on the left, the one that we know as common garden sage, or the one on the right, Salvia fruticosa, which is not as hardy, of course, and but is also grown as at the cloisters, because some people believe that this may have been the original an important sage, and that this importance was later extended to the one that we know as common sage. In point of fact, when you go to a supermarket and buy sage as a culinary herb, you're really getting a combination of these two herbs. And the fruticosa is a very beautiful, scented plant, highly aromatic, and very, very fond of the crushed leaves just to inhale, and I also use it in cooking, but it is somewhat tender, so it has to be dug and kept indoors in the winter in a greenhouse if you have one, because it takes quite a while to get back to a good size in cooler climates. Now, this reputation of sage had a lot of resonance, and that's one of the things I want to point out to you today, that it's not just a question of having these little lists of how a plant was used or where it appears in the Middle Ages. But these plants had great networks of associated meaning and significance. It's not a one-for-one thing like the Victorian language of flowers. And sage, as I said, had this reputation as just a sovereign remedy for all of the ills of mankind. And I'm just going to take the time to tell you a little story here. What you're seeing here is actually an illuminated manuscript that of Boccaccio's famous Decameron. And this is a story which I think takes place on the 4th day of the Decameron. And it's the story of Simona and Pasquino and the poisoned sage. And this is a story of two lovers who rendezvous in a garden. They lie down to make love in the sage. The lover, Pasquino, after making love, instead of before, which is curious, sort of reaches out and takes a few leaves of the sage to rub on his teeth. to clean them. And this was a common use of sage in the Middle Ages that extended well beyond that, because, as you know, the leaves are rather rough, and it is a plant that has antibacterial properties and is strongly scented. So it was used as a dentifrice. But lo and behold, immediately after applying the sage to his teeth, Pasquino turns blue-black and dies. Some other friends who are in the garden are summoned by Simona. They see Pasquino dead, and they assume that she has murdered him. She's arrested, she's taken off to be judged. The judge really questions whether she would be capable of such a thing. She brings him back to the garden to show him what happened. She rubs her own teeth at the sage and drops dead. Now, of course, part of the shock value of this story is that sage is such a beneficent plant that it's almost impossible to believe that someone would be poisoned by sage. But lo and behold, when the sage bush is dug up, it turns out that there's a poisoned toad underneath it, and that was the cause of the problem. Yet another iconic healing herb used for magical and medicinal purposes in the Middle Ages is rue, Ruta graveolens. And here I have yet another quotation from the Hortulus. I won't read the whole thing to you, but you'll notice that a lot of emphasis is put on its fragrance and the fact that it has many healing powers, including being good against poison. It was also thought to be good against any kind of evil or malign influence. And it does seem that in the Middle Ages, it's the herbs that were particularly fragrant, the ones that were really pungent like rue, that were most powerful against disease or other kinds of evil, as if the power of the plant really existed in its fragrance. It's not unaligned to modern notions of aromatherapy. And on the left, what you see is a page from yet another type of medieval document. This is not quite like the herbals that we looked at earlier. This is really a sort of self-help handbook that was intended to be used not by doctors or apothecaries, but by ordinary people, although these very heavily illuminated manuscripts of these were really used by very wealthy people. But here you see a doctor holding up a plant of rue and presenting it to his patient. It was thought to be good for many things, again, like fennel, to be particularly good for your eyesight. And it kept away witches, fairies, any sort of evil influence. So powerful was it that you didn't need to ingest it. You could simply wear it around your neck or hang it above your door to keep away evil. Now I've assigned the other herbs to categories according to the habitat in the garden. And this is from a 15th century German herbal. It's a woodcut of wild ginger, which is not actually one of the plants I'm going to discuss, but you might recognize it. This is Bonifant garden, which is the garden at the cloisters that is devoted to medieval plants. There is another garden that contains medieval plants, but the better part of the medieval plant collection is at home in this garden. And there you see a detail of the center of the garden with our famous quince trees and many woodland plants that like shade as well as wildflowers are grown in that situation. And the rest of the garden is very largely open to the sun. And the first one I'm going to talk about is probably the earliest flowering plant, and this is the Christmas rose, Helleborus niger, which enjoys part to full shade. And it self-sows very freely in a moist situation. And once you get it established, you'll have no problem keeping it going. You'll just have to eliminate the seedlings that you don't want. And although we know it as the Christmas rose, that association with Christmas really does not go back to the Middle Ages. That's really a Victorian association. Because of changes that were made in the calendar, the plants that were known to the Middle Ages now bloom some 10 days later than they would have then. And Christmas rose became associated with Christmas in the Victorian period, and when there also were greenhouses and the plant could be forced for the holiday. What it was known for in the Middle Ages was as being an excellent cure for madness and melancholy, even though it was known to be a poisonous plant and was somewhat dangerous to use. It did have that use. Now, they used many plants as purgatives in the Middle Ages because this is a very cathartic plant that would no longer be used because they are considered to be too dangerous. However, when I was doing some research on plants associated with Christmas for a program at the New York Botanical Garden, I did find out that there some modern taxonomic studies indicate that it's not as poisonous as it once was believed to be. Now, this is another hellebore grown at the cloisters and one of my favorite plants. I really find the flowers very, very appealing and charming. It blooms a little later than the Christmas rose for us. But this is known as stinking hellebore, Helleborus fetidus, but you needn't be afraid to grow it. It's not going to stink up your garden. In fact, the scent is said to come from the roots, but I have never found it to be particularly offensive. Now, this plant was used interchangeably with the black hellebore that we just looked at, but it was also used in veterinary medicine, and I've never yet given a talk on veterinary medicine in the Middle Ages, but it would be interesting to do because we do have an important text, and we do know something about how the plants were administered. And according to the Roman natural historian Pliny, who was preserved in the medieval herbals, this plant was used to treat cattle who were diseased, and you would make an incision in the dewlap of the cattle, and you would take a piece of the hellebore root and you would insert it into that incision to effect a cure. Now, this is another plant grown under the quince trees. This is wood betony, Stachys officinalis, and this is another one of those plants that had a reputation as a virtual panacea. And here I have a quote from Walfrid Strabo, in which you can see that he feels that his muse would be defeated and overwhelmed if he had to add any more to the virtues of betony that he's already aware of because of the honor that the plant has won. So he does talk about drying it, storing it, using it fresh, using it dry, but whatever you like to do, the wonderful powers of the herb will supply all your needs. And he is not the only witness to the virtues of betony. There is an ancient document by Antonius Musa, who was the physician to the Roman Emperor Augustine, that's completely devoted to betony. The whole treatise is about the virtues of that single herb. Now, this plant we're looking at next is not one of the great Mediterranean herbs of antiquity. This is an herb of northern climes, but it was used in the Middle Ages. And this is sweet Cicely Maris odorata, a very pretty shade-loving plant. Again, it grows at the cloisters in the shelter of the quince trees. It will spread when well established in moist shade and a fertile soil, but it doesn't go so obnoxiously. It's very easy to remove it if you want to. I have a close-up of the seeds on the left, and it is important if you want to grow sweet Cicely from seed to use fresh seeds. It doesn't grow well from seeds that are not fresh. So you actually need to find a friend who has it and collect yourself some nice fresh seed, and don't be ordering it from a seed house because you won't get happy results. But this is a very sweet plant, and a sugar syrup can be made from the leaves, and it was thought to be very, very beneficial for the stomach. Another beautiful woodland plant is the Solomon seal, Polygonatum odoratum, and you see a detail of it growing in the cloisters gardens on the right, and there down below you see a section of the root. Now it was called Solomon's seal because of these markings on the root, which were interpreted in, as a reference to a royal seal, or it was also said that if you cut open the root, you would see markings that looked like Hebrew letters. So that gave something of a mystic significance to the plant, but it was thought to be good for bruising of any kind. You could make a poultice out of it and apply it to a bruise. And according to the great 16th century herbalist John Gerard, who preserves many medieval uses, it was particularly useful to women who had, and I quote, stumbled against the fists of their husbands. Now, some of these old documents don't always make cheerful reading, but it was thought to be very, very good for bruising. And here, as you see, again, in a very friendly environment where it's got plenty of moisture and shade, it will spread and make a beautiful carpet, although it's most beautiful when it's seen in profile in smaller groups. Now, this is a plant that you may not be as familiar with as you are with some of the others that I'm talking about today. This is herb Paris, or true love, Paris quadrifolia, and it is related to R. trillium. It is a plant that really can't be grown very well from seed. You do need to grow it from divisions. It's very, very beautiful in spring. It emerges in early May. But in the heat of the summer, the leaves die down and disappear. But I always had great success in dividing it once it became dormant or semi-dormant. And if you plant even a few divisions, within a few years, if it's in the right spot, you'll have a very attractive colony of the plant. Now, this plant is an example of something I haven't really talked to you about yet, but which is fundamental to many of the plants we'll be talking about later. It was thought in the Middle Ages that a plant might, the medicinal or other use of a plant, might be indicated by how it grew, where it grew, when it grew, and this was a sort of sign of what the plant was good for. And for a long time, this was really all dismissed as superstitious nonsense, but modern scholars think that it may very well be that herbalists knew very well what these plants were good for, that knowledge was based on many centuries of practical experiment. But these seemingly magical signs that were assigned to the plants were really a mnemonic device that helped the herbalist to remember what the plant was good for. So in other words, it wasn't the case that you thought a plant would make a good diuretic simply because its flowers were yellow. Many plants that had yellow flowers might not be used as a diuretic, but it was a way of helping you remember that a plant like dandelion, of course, also known as pissabed, would be good for that. Now, in this particular example, this blue-black berry was associated with melancholy or black bile, and this particular fruit was thought to be, like the hellebore, a good cure for melancholy. But the plant is a May-blooming plant, and it had another association, like many plants that bloomed in May, with sexuality and fertility and with love. And very often in the Middle Ages, the idea of death was also part of that equation. We tend to separate those ideas, but they didn't in the Middle Ages. But I have down here a little quotation from a medieval poem in which it's made clear that in spring, people would pluck these plants, and the true love, as it's called here, was worn by people on their hats or hoods or their purses, and it was a symbol of love. But the last line makes it clear that the true love is a fragile thing and not so common as it was in the olden days, and this is a belief that was current already in the Middle Ages and continues to be held to today. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with the flower spikes of the common foxglove, and the reason I've chosen to show you a detail that really accentuates the spotting in the throat of each of those bells is that this is another good example of the doctrine of signatures, which actually was current in the Middle Ages, although it wasn't formally christened the doctrine of signatures until the Renaissance. Many plants that have spotting or freckling in the throat were thought to be good for diseases of the skin or good for the complexion. Now, this particular plant was thought to be especially good for scrofula, which was a tuberculosis of the skin. And you may know that for centuries, in fact, this plant was assigned from Linnaeus onward to the family, the Scrofulariaceae, in memory of that medieval use. However, it's now been reassigned on the basis of genetic evidence to the plantain family. And I have to say, I find that incredibly disconcerting, and it really spoils my story. But it is a fact that the old botany is now really being radically revised. And those of us who learned all the old names and the old families have to go back to school and do our homework. Now, you probably are more than familiar with the use of foxglove as a source of digitalis, as a heart medicine, but that, in fact, is a use that was corroborated in the 18th century by Dr. William Withering, and it is not known to have been used that way in the Middle Ages. I'm going to show you some spring wildflowers, many of which are associated with the month of May and with love and fertility. And the sources that we have for our medieval herbs are not limited to the kind of documentary and literary sources that we've talked about so far. We also have, of course, many artistic sources. And over on the left, you see the unicorn in captivity, the most famous of the unicorn tapestries in the Cloisters collection. And the body of the unicorn, and we'll see more details of this, is surrounded by these May-blooming plants that have these associations with sexuality, with love and fertility. And you may know that the flora of the unicorn tapestries was studied in the 1940s by a team of botanists working at the New York Botanical Garden. And they were able to identify more than 80 of the 100 plants shown in the unicorn tapestries with a fair degree of botanical confidence, and they produced a key that identifies the plants tapestry by tapestry. And the first one I'm going to talk about is the English bluebell. Here you see a detail from the tapestry. And this is a very sappy, juicy plant that was associated with fertility in the Middle Ages. It was one of the plants that, along with true love and others that I'll be naming, was gathered early in May and used to bring into the towns, used to decorate the outsides of houses as a sort of greeting of the spring and as a blessing on fertility and the renewal of the year. Now, here's a bluebell wood in England, and you would be most unlikely to ever be able to recreate a bluebell wood like the ones that we find in England and Northern Europe. And in fact, they really develop this way in a situation like this, where they're growing in a woodland that is coppiced, that is cut down on a cycle that allows the plant to benefit from a cycle of shade and sun over the course of years. But this is sort of an interesting example of a plant that has accrued a lot of cultural significance. In the Middle Ages, it was pretty much associated with fertility, but it now, and after being praised and prized by the Romantic poets in England in the 19th century, it really is kind of a cult flower and is almost a symbol of Englishness. And I just want to point out, because many of the plants I've talked to you about, I'm sure you will be concerned about as being potentially invasive, because all of them are by definition aliens, It is true that in our gardens in the USA and landscapes in the USA, you have to be quite conscious about what you're doing and whether there is any potential for the plant becoming problematic. But no one in England or anywhere else ever complains about the invasiveness of bluebells because it's a plant that has been assigned an honored status. And I just want to point out that there's a certain amount of irrationality in the way that we look at these things. There's also a certain amount of concern in England because it is such a symbol of Englishness that the English bluebell has interbred the Spanish bluebell and is now hybridizing everywhere and threatening the true blueness of the English bluebell. Another European plant that you might not be as familiar with that blooms in May and has this association with fertility that I've been talking about and grows again in close contiguity to the unicorn's body is the cuckoo pint or auriculatum. And of course you can very readily recognize this genus because of the very distinctive form of the flower. Like calla lily, it has a spadix, which is this hooded form, and a spade, which is the blot at the center. Now, the form of this plant suggested copulation to the medieval mind, and it has many, many suggestive names in the Middle Ages in many European languages as well as English. And it's known as lords and ladies, Adam and Eve, cuckoo pint, which really means cuckoo's penis. It has a very, very strong association with sexuality. And as I said before, this association with sexuality was also somewhat sinister in its association with death and with the devil. And the black markings that are referred to in the botanical name maculatum are very clear on these uncultivated forms of the plants. And they were a sign that this was a powerful plant, but one that was somewhat sinister. Now, in this particular case, unlike the bluebell, the plant was used medicinally, and it was thought to be aphrodisiac. It was thought also to be very nourishing. You would dig up the roots of this plant, which are starchy, and are filled with oxalic acid crystals, and actually very acrid and poisonous until it's cooked. But once it was cooked, it was considered to be nourishing and to be an aphrodisiac and to increase fertility. We know from 16th century sources that it was used as a starch for laundry. And Elizabethan laundresses actually had a severe rash on their hands that was an occupational hazard that came from working with the starch from the roots. Now this is a much more beneficent looking plant. This is the beautiful Arometallicum. It has some marbling on the leaves. This is the species. You can find Italian arums that are cultivars that have much more marked and marbled markings on the leaves. This blooms a little bit after the cuckoo pint, and it lasts much longer in the garden. The cuckoo pint really sort of disappears altogether after the early spring. But this one maintains its foliage much later. I haven't shown you any of the berries, which are beautiful orange scarlet, but eventually in the heat of the summer the entire plant will disappear. But I always really enjoyed using this plant in winter bouquets at the cloisters because it will really stay green well into December, and the leaves sort of, even after a frost, will sort of just bounce back and are still very attractive. This is the cowslip, one of the most famous of medieval plants, Primula veris, and it was famous in artistic and poetic contexts as well as a medicine. And you'll notice the flowers have this nodding habit, and that was a sign that they were good for palsy or shaking. They were also thought to be good for paralysis, good for headache, and they were one of the harbingers of spring, perhaps the most important, one of the flowers that Chaucer mentions as the first flower of spring. And unlike the other spring wildflowers that we've been looking at, they really are a flower of open, sunny, moist fields rather than a flower of the woodland. But these were gathered along with other plants we've just talked about to celebrate the May, to bring in the spring, and to ensure the renewal of life for the coming year. Here's another beautiful example of a spring blooming plant that may or may not be familiar to you. Well, I think more people should be growing it because not only are the flowers very attractive, but so are the beautiful seed heads. Now this was formerly classed as an anemone. It really isn't a woodland plant. It really likes to be grown out in the open. But it did have an interesting medieval use. The purple flowers that you see, like some other blue or purple flowers of the Middle Ages, could be used to extract a juice that colored paper and other materials green. And this particular plant, called Pasch flower, because it bloomed near Easter, was used to make a green vegetable dye to color Easter eggs. And we know that this was done at the French court in the Middle Ages. This is another one of the May flowers that was particularly associated with renewal and fertility. This is ragged robin. This is in the dianthus family. And as you can see from the Latin name, it's another one of these cuckoo flowers that were associated with the bird, the cuckoo, who returned to Europe in the spring from Africa. And this is a plant that has mostly this folkloric association with renewal. It is not one plant that has a lot of practical uses. But again, just like the cuckoo pine, there was something a little bit sinister about the plant in the sense that it was so powerful and much associated both with the English Robin Goodfellow or Puck and his German counterpart Ruprecht. It's a fairy plant associated with the bird the cuckoo, who was sinister in his predilection, or her predilection rather, of laying eggs in other birds' nests. So it's a sexuality that is powerful but somewhat frightening. And this plant will, it's quite hardy, and it will really spread very aggressively in moist situations. And this is a moist meadow in the Catskill Mountains in Zone 4, where my house is. And you can see that it has really, really spread itself along the road in a very, very wet meadow. This is the last of the spring wildflowers that I'm going to talk about. And this is Germander speedwell, Veronica comedris. It was a much loved plant in the Middle Ages, and it appears in many, many, many books of hours as an ornamental detail in the borders. And you can recognize it and distinguish it from other small blue flowers, like forget-me-nots that might also appear in these borders, by these little anthers, which are quite distinctive. Now this is another super hardy plant that grows all over the Catskill Mountains, as well as being grown in gardens. It belongs to the mint family, and you can see the characteristic leaves there. And like many blue flowers, it was thought to be especially good for the eyesight. I have some flowering herbs for the sun here. Some of these herbs are annual. You're probably familiar with borrage's reputation as a giver of a lightener of spirits and a reliever of melancholy because of the old adage, I borage give courage, which is a pun on its name that goes back to the Middle Ages. It was also used in cooling drinks and as a vegetable. And here we have the pot marigold, Calendula officinalis, a hardy annual, one of my favorite plants, and one that really does well in cool weather situations and gives beautiful color to the garden in from say September well into December, sometimes even persisting in January, even at the Cloisters Gardens, but tends to punk out in the heat of summer. But this is a plant that often appears in medieval art. It was associated with the Virgin Mary. I'm sorry, that detail on the right is a bit blurry. And here you see it on the right in profile, and for whatever reason is almost always shown that way in medieval depictions. And this is a plant that was used as a substitute for saffron and gave an appetizing color to butter and to cheese. This is another favorite plant of mine, the very stately and striking elecampane, Inula. It likes a moist but sunny situation, will get quite tall, and it is fairly hardy. And I've given you a little quote here from that Italian medical school. It was thought to be, again, good for grief of mind and to cheer the heart. It was also thought to keep away, by the Anglo-Saxons, to keep away any sort of evil influence. So there were many plants in the Middle Ages that were not used to cure not only physical ills, but psychological ills. Here are some flowers of the field, and people often ask me whether many of the plants of the Middle Ages are extinct or threatened. And actually, the ones that are most threatened are the common grain field weeds, like the corn poppy, because of the modern use of herbicides. They were once really common in Europe, and they no longer are. But here on this detail on the right, you'll see that the poppies and cornflowers are growing amid the grain. There was no hope of eradicating them in the Middle Ages. And although it was not as potent as the opium poppy, which was used medicinally in the Middle Ages, the corn poppy was used in much the same way as a reliever of pain. And of course, the beautiful cornflower, which almost always appears in medieval illuminations alongside the poppy, was used medicinally as well. And like the germander speedwell, like many plants with blue flowers, it was thought to be especially good for the eyes. Now, both these plants are plants of grasslands, and we grow them in our gardens and are forced to stake them and are distressed that they're so floppy. But really, the best way to grow them is up coming through grass, where the grass holds them up. That's really how they evolved to grow. And there you see them growing in the cloister's gardens. Now, this is another plant of the fields that likes an open, dry, sunny situation that you might not be familiar with. This is the Carline thistle, and the Carline comes from the name of the Emperor Charlemagne, just as in the historical term Carolingian, to refer to that period. And what you see down here on the right is, oh, I'm sorry. What you see down below on the right is actually a representation of the emperor who was granted a vision of this particular thistle growing in a field. His army was decimated by a plague, and an angel instructed him to shoot an arrow into the air. It struck the Carline thistle. He realized that this plant was the cure, and he was able to save his soldiers from this disease. It was also used, and still is in parts of Europe, as a rustic hygrometer, and you can nail it to the door and it will open when sunny weather is coming and close when it is going to rain. This is one of my favorite field flowers. This is the meadowsweet. It's much, much more refined and elegant plant than its American relative, Queen of the Meadow, and also very, very hardy. Now, this plant has a beautiful, beautiful scent. It also, the flowers have a very sweet scent. The leaves have a scent of cucumber. It was used in the Middle Ages as a strewing herb. You would strew plants on the floors of houses and churches, and when you stepped on them, the fragrance was released. And it was a way also of using these aromatic plants to keep down vermin on the floor. Now, it was once categorized as belonging to the genus Spirea. And like the willow, it contains a lot of salicylic acid. And it was used in the Middle Ages for fevers and for pain. And in fact, our name aspirin comes from Spirea in reference to this plant, because that salicylic acid in aspirin was first extrapolated not from the willow, but from the meadowsweet. Now, the garden flowers of the Middle Ages were also used medicinally and for practical purposes, although they were appreciated for ornament and for fragrance. And of course, the rose is at the head and center of the list. And I have so many beautiful images of medieval roses. It was very hard for me to choose. But they did have both red and white roses, but they didn't have nearly the many, many roses that we have now. On the left, you see another illustration from the Decameron. On the right, you see ladies gathering red and white roses for garlands. And this was a very, very common occupation, clearly, for aristocratic ladies. We have many, many representation of women gathering roses that date to the period. Now, this is the white rose of the Middle Ages, Rosa ex alba semiplana. I'm sorry to report that the beautiful bush on the left has since died, but this is a very lovely and fragrant rose that has the additional virtue, because it's an alba rose, of being very much more resistant to fungal diseases than some of the red roses. And this is the great red rose of the Middle Ages, Rosa gallica officinalis. Whenever you see that in a plant name, as you very well may know, it means it's the plant of the apothecaries, the one that did have a medicinal use. Now, again, this is a very, very fragrant rose. It was used, it has the virtue of retaining its scent. It was used in cordials and syrups. Roses were thought to be good against headache and to be generally strengthening, but they also had many symbolic uses and were associated with love, not in the sense of the slightly sinister carnal love that was associated with cuckoo pine, for instance, but rather with true and honorable and noble love. You'll notice that the roses that we're looking at are very, very open, and they don't have, they're doubled, but they're not fully doubled. And they did have garden roses in the Middle Ages that were doubled, as these are, and that didn't just have wild roses, but we can always see the stamens as the center of the rose. And here is an example, because I wanted to make this point. If you look on the left, there's a detail of a trellised rose from a tapestry at the cloisters. And as far as we know, the only red rose that they had in the Middle Ages was the Rosa gallica, which really only grew to be about knee-high. So how did they get these roses up and over these trellises? And as best we know, they must have grafted them, and grafting was a technique that was alive well in the Middle Ages, inherited from antiquity. And on the left, you see the dog rose, which does have long, pliable, flexible canes. It could have been grafted to create these trellises and arbors. Now, after the rose, the lily is the queen of garden flowers. I have yet another quote for you here. And of course, there are two words in Latin for white. There's candidum, which means a shining white, and alba, which means a dull white. And lily and candidum was, because of its white and gold, its shining white color, was thought to be an emblem of paradise. That reputation was in white and gold being the colors of paradise. It also had a divine fragrance. So it was very much associated with the Virgin, with the paradise, with the saints. But at the same time, and this seems odd to us, it had some very humble uses as a medicinal plant. And at the bottom on the left, you see a very stylized rendering of the Donna lily in an Anglo-Saxon version of that ancient herbal, the herbal of Apuleius. And it was used as a cure for baldness. It was a cure for scalds and burns, as well as being a sacred herb. And it appears again and again in its sacred context in medieval annunciations as a symbol of the virginity of Mary, and you see it on the right in that context, but it appears just as often in medieval herbals as a practical cure. There are some other lilies that were grown in medieval gardens that are well worth growing. This is the beautiful Martagon lily, St. Bernard's lily. And this one I hesitated about whether I should include it because it does not have a lot of medieval lore, but it is represented in 15th century paintings, and it begins to appear with other flowers that are associated with the Virgin. And this is a beautiful European lily called Lily bulbiferum, the orange lily, the variety is Crocaeum, and apparently it is edible. The bulbs could be cooked and eaten. It's not a plant that has a medicinal use, but I came to know it first from this beautiful detail from the Portinari triptych, which is in Florence, one of the most exquisite flower renderings of the late Middle Ages. Irises, too, had a very prominent part in the medieval herb garden. This is the fleur de luce, the Iris ex-Germanica, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, very prominently featured in unicorn tapestries, a very hardy, easy-to-grow plant. And it was renowned for its color and its fragrance, but it also had practical uses as a starch. And here we see the form known as Iris, which has a very pale flower, which doesn't last quite as long in the garden as the Germanica itself. And here you see a quote from the Hortulus. And the laundrymen of the Middle Ages included a starch scented with iris to perfume their clothes. And you may know, it's just a bit of ethnobotanical curiosity, that the beautiful fragrance, which resembles violets, that these rhizomes have, doesn't really develop until the rhizomes have been aged for 3 years. So it's one of those ethnobotanical mysteries. How did people discover that? This is Iris pallida, a very tall, graceful, beautiful plant that was used in the same way that the Iris germanica was used in the Middle Ages, but is even more ornamental and has a very stately, graceful presence in the garden. And yellow flag, which you may consider as a weed, even though White Flower Farm continues to sell a rhizome for $9, was also used medicinally in the Middle Ages. The root, the rhizome of this one is actually very cathartic. It was a strong purgative. It's no longer used in medicine, herbal medicine anymore. But like many other medieval plants, not only did it have a practical use, it was symbolic as well. The color yellow was associated with jealousy. And over here on the left, you see an allegorical romance, one of the great romances of the Middle Ages, the Romance of the Rose. And the castle of jealousy is shown with yellow flag growing in the moat around the castle. This is the last iris I'm going to show you. This is Stinking Gladwin, Iris fetidissima. This is another plant like the hellebore we talked about that you really needn't fear to grow. It's not going to smell bad. But this is actually a very, very small, low-growing plant. The flower, although it looks quite beautiful in this close-up, can be somewhat insignificant, but it is grown for these beautiful orange berries, which persist, which appear in the fall and persist into the winter. Violets were important in the Middle Ages. They were enjoyed as ornamental plants and enjoyed for their perfume, but they were also used medicinally, thought to be good against headaches. We have a medieval book of instructions in which a man teaches his young wife how to cultivate violets. They were a symbol in the Middle Ages, and of course they can be candied and eaten. They were in the Middle Ages a symbol of humility because they were so low growing. And because of that low stature and the beautiful color and scent, they were one of the plants associated with the Virgin Mary, who was admired for her humility. And you may have noticed the little violets strewn in front of the vase in the Portinari triptych I showed you with the orange lily. And wild pansy or heart ease, which is still a beloved plant, bore multiple symbolisms in the Middle Ages. It was associated with passion in both senses of the word. In the sufferings of Christ, it was known as herb trinity because of the 3 colors. But it was also associated with love and specifically with passionate love. And you may remember in A Midsummer's Night Dream, a little purple flowered plant that was squeezed into the eyes of a Titania, and that made her fall in love with Bottom. And that was, in fact, the Viola tricolor. And the last of the garden flowers I'm going to show you is the European peony. Not the peony so common in our gardens, although it was common in American gardens in the 19th century, until it was replaced by the Chinese peony that we now grow so widely. But this is another plant that was admired for its beauty, but that also was thought to have sort of magically enhanced medicinal powers, and it was thought to be particularly good as an amulet against evil, and also as a cure for epilepsy, which was a disease, of course, of mysterious supernatural causes. And both the root and the seeds of the peony were used in that way. There were legends put around by the ancient Greek root gatherers, who were sort of the base of the ancient knowledge of herbs, that it was very dangerous to dig peony in the daylight, and if you did, woodpeckers would come and peck at your eyes. And nowadays it's thought that that kind of story was put around by professionals who didn't want amateurs horning in on the drug trade. And I'm going to close with some legendary medieval plants for the daring. These plants can be grown, and I encourage you to try. You might have to take a little more trouble to get hold of them, but they're fun to do. And the first that you see, of course, here is from a medieval herbal. It's a woodcock, and it shows a mandrake and a woman drake. And here are some mandrakes growing in the cloister's garden. They bloom very early, usually about St. Patrick's Day. And over on the right, you see a detail of that very, very distinctive flower. I learned from Helen Dillon in Dublin that in order to get this really profuse flowering on your mandrakes, you need to hand pollinate them with a little paintbrush, because they bloom so early that there aren't yet a lot of bees out. But if you take the trouble to cross-pollinate the flowers, you will get a really, really nice display. And here on the left is another image from that Italian self-help herbal I told you about that shows the story of the mandrake, which was often depicted in medieval herbals. And it was believed that it was very dangerous, just as with the peony, to dig up the mandrake or pull up the mandrake. If you pulled it up, the mandrake would shriek. If you heard it shriek, you would die. So you had to go out with a dog who was very thirsty, tie the dog to the mandrake, place a dish of water in front of the dog, just out of his reach so that he yanked out the mandrake. The mandrake would shriek, the dog would die, and he would be in possession of a very valuable root. And I actually once dug up a mandrake for a documentary film. Needless to say, there were no bad results. But this was a great and famous story that people loved to repeat. Now, over on the right, you'll see that the actual mandrake root really doesn't much resemble the human form. It was really, really exaggerated in medieval herbals and carved into, touched up to resemble more closely the human form. Now, this next plant down here, thorn apple, is a datura and an extremely poisonous plant. It's one of the plants in the nightshade family that was used in the Middle Ages magically, and it was used by witches in a preparation known as flying ointment. And these plants, like the mandrake and others, henbane for instance, were so poisonous that it was really dangerous to ingest them. But you could macerate them in a fatty substance and rub them into your skin. And they did induce hallucination. And historians of European witch trials think that the reports that witches made flying through the air were actually sensations that they had after rubbing themselves with the flying ointment made from these herbs. And the final plant that I'm going to talk to you about was one of my favorite teaching tools in the medieval garden at the cloisters, and this is Dragonarum dracunculus vulgaris, a relative of the cuckoo pint that we looked at earlier. And this was thought to be good in the Middle Ages against the bites of snakes, but it also could be used to magically conjure up snakes, although I'm not sure why you would have wanted to do that. But certainly it's a really good example of the way that these plants impressed themselves on the medieval mind as being beneficent or sinister sinister, because even with a modern scientific education, looking at this plant, which by the way is fly pollinated and imitates the scent of rotting meat, you have a very powerful sense of its sinister aura and its power. And again, this association with snakes is enhanced by this very, very curious modeling that you see on the stems, which strongly resemble snake skin. And you can get these bulbs from suppliers like Brent and Becky, or I think perhaps Old House Gardens carries it. I've given you some sources on your handouts. And it actually probably appeals more as a garden plant to our sensibility than it did to the Middle Ages. But I have seen this plant growing wild in Crete, sticking up out of a meadow, and it is very, very impressive and interesting plant. So that is the end of the program. I apologize for going a little long. I don't know if we will have time for some questions. I'd be happy to take them if you do. But if you have questions that we don't have time for, please do feel free to contact me. I have provided my contact information on the handouts. Thank you very much for your attention.
Deidre, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. There's so many details and so many wonderful plants and great stories that I know that everyone really, really enjoyed it. And the only comments coming in are thank you very much and how wonderfully informative it was. So with that, I think we will sign off for today. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for this webinar. Be sure to put the next webinar on your calendar. It is Wednesday, April 26th, 2 p.m. with Larry Weber. In a Patch of Goldenrods is the topic, our notable native for 2017. So thank you all for joining us once again.
Thank you.